Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading. Then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Alyssa Bream, and we are looking at a passage from Job chapter 13. What we find in Job chapter 13 is this continued desire of Job to have his day in court. Verse 3 tells us he's wanting to argue his case. Another interesting observation about the book of Job comes from how it's structured. There are kind of these three cycles of speeches. Job speaks first, his friends speak, he responds to their speeches. The Bible doesn't necessarily speak direct to us directly, call us by name, but sometimes indirectly through things like the structure of the passage, the context and how it takes place. In this case, the structure of the speech cycles have Job speaking first. This indicates he's not only responding to his friend's speeches, but he's also trying to work out his problem for himself. Do you talk to yourself?
I don't know if I would say I talk to myself, but I have an internal monologue that's going on at all times.
Well, at least internally. Yeah.
Right, right.
It's important for us to recognize the struggle of trying to make sense of a senseless situation. So he's trying to sort this out himself. And this is one of the ways we can identify with this story. But verses 7 through 11, he wants to be God's attorney. He attacks the fact that his friends dare to serve as God's attorney. You know, he has this strong belief in that. And there are some things that are underlying to this accusation. One, people often think they know how God thinks. We talked about that a little bit earlier this week. We make everything, this is how I would do it, or this is how I see it. Behind Job's point of view lies this implication that his friends think they understand God's reason for his trials. Things like, now I understand why God allowed whatever to take place. He was trying to do, and then we give some reason why we think he did it. The reality is God's complex, and we can't understand everything that he's doing. The second reason why I think Job is talking about his friends trying to be attorneys for God is God will judge people even when they defend his honor. God will judge people even when they defend his honor, when that defense misrepresents his character. So people may be defending him, but they're misrepresenting his character. And he says, will you defend God with lies? Will you slant your testimony in his favor? He's directing this at his friends because he believes they are slanting things that shouldn't be said in a particular way. And so some examples where we might say that, we might try to justify something that's happened, like the death of a loved one. We'll say things like God needed another angel in the choir. That's why our loved one died. Or God's doing this just to see how you're going to respond. Or God wants you to have faith. That's all you have. All you need to get healed, to get sober. Suffering is not, some of these things we've already covered this week. And the third kind of underlying assumption here for Job is when we defend God to someone who is suffering using our assumptions, at the root of those assumptions is the lack of the fear of the Lord. And he says, does his majesty terrify you? He's asking them this question. You see, when we think of the fear of the Lord, it is usually in a context of hearing someone curse God or say something that we don't think they should. But sometimes our well-meaning platitudes can also represent a lack of the fear of the Lord. And so Job thinks, knowing why, he's like, if I can just put God on his stand, make him ask, and find out why, it's going to solve my dilemma. He says, God might kill me, but I have no other hope to argue my case, but to argue my case with God. And even though Job is wrong about his assumptions where God is concerned, the reader should be struck by Job's incredible fear and awe of God. That's something I think all of us could work on is even when we're frustrated with God, we have this deep amount of reverence where he's concerned. And, he's asking God, he says, remove your heavy hand from me. He wants a face-to-face meeting with God. He says, summon me so I can answer. He seems acutely aware that he can't force God to have a meeting, but he desperately wants to have this meeting. And so there's so much we could talk about. Like this, when we talk about the book of Job, much of what we talk about becomes this ongoing conversation. But one of the things that I'm curious about today is, do you think there are times when we have to forgive God? Like, not because God has sinned or done something wrong, but because we've been hurt by how he allowed our life to play out.
I think I probably wouldn't use the word forgive.
Mhm.
I probably would use more of a word of like repair the relationship. And I think sometimes that even comes down to just surrendering to God again, just saying, whatever you have for my life, I will accept it. I think that that's part of what we do. There are times that I have thoroughly questioned God, and I think thinking back to the times where that happened, there were enough human involvements with people that it was easy to put the blame on people instead of putting it solely on God. Where Job's situation was such a snap, bam, like there was no human he
Acts
could.
of God.
Right,
Yeah.
they were very obvious acts of God. And thinking back through the situations that have caused me pain, I can't think of like an extreme act of God that would have caused me pain, but there were enough humans involved that eventually, once I worked through some of those relational issues and forgiveness and all of that, it kind of got back to God, and I had to work through what that meant for my relationship with God. If I really truly believe that God is in control, then how am I reconciling this with what went on and the pain that was caused? And usually it wasn't his action, but what I would consider God's inaction
Mhm.
in a situation when I really thought that I was doing what was right. And not just in the right of like, oh, I'm not sinning. Why isn't my life going right? But like a decision that I would make and just got blocked and just nothing would come of it. And I've had to find it's just that continual like laying down of that. Sometimes you have to put that question out to God, even though you're not maybe going to get a response. You have to let God know you have those questions and finding that hope and peace again. And yesterday we talked about some other things, and the idea that has partially helped me with this is what psychology would call reframing. So I had to change the way that I told myself the story of what happened in my head. I had to change and reword it and rework it, kind of wordsmith it almost in my own head to make it so that it's not so painful. So here's like this isn't the thing causing the most pain in my life, but here at church we have very flexible working hours. Like really flexible, like extension cord flexible.
Mhm.
Like, I mean, there's times when we have to be here, but most of the time, but I still normally am here, 8:30 to 5 or so. And so then when I get messages outside of work, it causes me more frustration than it should. And I realize that. But the way I'm able to reframe that is being appreciative for the freedom that I have throughout the rest of the week. Because when I have an appointment, when I have a kid is sick or something like that, I'm able to do that. And it's because I'm going to get messages outside of work. And so when you're able to reframe things in your head and think of them in a healthier way, including your relationship with God, I think that that is a very valuable thing. If you can tell your story in a different way and make it maybe not as painful, then that loop that gets stuck in your head will maybe dissipate and cause less distress. I
Do
just said a
you
whole bunch of
no,
words.
do you find it easier to reframe or someone else's conversation than one that directly affects you? Meaning, if it's going on in my life,
Mhm.
somebody has offended me, or something, some trouble is my way. Do you find it easier to speak to me and say, maybe it's this, than you do for yourself?
I think it is easier, although I'm trying to think of a situation where I've tried to reframe for other people.
I think you do that more than you realize.
Do I?
Yeah, and I think we probably all do,
Yeah,
because we're not stuck in it.
right.
We're able to say, well, it probably wasn't this, or this is,
Mhm.
I see it a different way. And, it
Right.
offers a different perspective. I know when I'm in it,
Mhm.
um, I'm not always able to reframe it.
Right.
You know, um, I know I should, but I'm not
Mhm.
always able to. But I can do it pretty well for other people. Like I can back away from the situation. When I'm going to do the most damage, it's when I've like lasered in on one thing and I can't turn it loose. Like as long as I'm up
Mhm.
here, like I can see, okay, that's not that big of a deal. But if I get on something and I can't get off of it, man, it's very, very difficult.
Right. I think it's while it might be somewhat helpful sometimes, especially if reframing is a new concept that maybe you haven't done, to be like, hey, if you maybe think about it this way, maybe that won't be as frustrating. Um, it's much more helpful when you can start to do it yourself, when
Hmm.
it's your own, because as I've worked on this and made this a practice in my life to reframe things, I find myself doing it without saying, okay, I need to reframe it. Like, it'll just happen because my brain is getting rewired to think more positively. Man, I am not like a positive person.
Hmm.
I don't think that isn't like Ruth Ann is Pollyanna. Like she is like happy and go lucky and she sees the best in every situation. I feel like I'm fairly cynical at times,
Hmm.
probably like a broken idealistic
Hmm.
person. I don't know. That's probably where my cynicism comes from. But reframing has helped me to become less cynical and less frustrated. And so I think I am sure that there are lots of resources out there that explain it way better than I can. But it's a practice that, Job gets stuck in these loops of like, all of them get stuck in those
If
loops.
God was here,
If God was here, if I could just plead my case, and if there would have been just some maybe shifting of those thoughts, he could have been at a healthier place. But then we wouldn't be able to have this conversation. So,
exactly.
you
Yeah,
know,
I would agree.
you can stay stuck in that loop, Job.
As I pondered this question, have I ever had to forgive God? I I'm not. I don't think that's how I would want to describe it. And you talked about situations where um, there were humans involved. You could always trace it back to a human, even though if it affected your relationship with God. Almost all of the horrible situations I found myself in, I could see how I played a role in it being, you know,
Hmm.
I was suffering because, some stupid I'd done. Only one situation in my life, like as I pondered this, there probably are more, but only one that I can think of. Do I want to ask God why He chose me to have to be the one to deal with it? Because I didn't. It wasn't. I didn't go out looking for it. I didn't want it, and it wasn't like it was like four or five things all having to converge at this particular time for me to have even had to be a part of it. And I wouldn't say I didn't have to forgive God, but I have sure asked God a lot of questions.
Hmm.
Why? Just like, I don't understand. I don't know. I'm sure there's a reason for it. Um, I'm sure He sees something I don't, but And I have experienced all of the emotions, from sadness to grief to anger to frustration to just to embarrassment, all of those things, you walk through. And probably this time through Job, I've read it differently than before, because all of these characters are playing some kind of role. Job didn't ask for this, but they didn't either. That's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they didn't ask to have a friend who's lost everything, right?
Right.
What a horrible situation to walk up on. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I've lost my kids, I've lost my stuff, my house, everything that I've spent my whole life working, I've lost it all. They didn't ask to have to be his friend. The one thing I'll give them is they at least they showed up,
Right.
that there's something to be said for that, I think.
As Job seeks this understanding of God, the more I've grown in my relationship with the Lord, and just growing in life as you get older and you learn more and you become wiser and all of those great things, the more you realize that you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just the place where God gives us understanding that we can handle and not more. And sometimes we just have to come to peace with that, is that we'll have the understanding that we can have. And as we grow, maybe we'll know more about why certain things happen, but just having that peace and understanding that no matter how much we learn, there will always be questions, and being okay with that.
The things you don't know, are you comfortable with that?
I would say a part of the maturing process is being okay with not knowing. And so there are certain things that I really wish I would know, but I've become much more comfortable in not knowing and
Mhm.
accepting that kind of gray area, and being at peace with that, and growing as growth happens naturally, and as I seek to learn more. It doesn't bother me as much as it probably would have in college, that there were things that I didn't know.
Earlier this week, you talked about the big debate that busted out about mystery
Mm-hmm.
and not knowing knowledge. Like, in hindsight, one of the observations I recognize about that whole conversation is personality driven. Are there things I don't know and I can't answer? The answer to that is yes, and I knew that then. Like, that wasn't a
Mm-hmm.
surprise. But I don't want to sit and talk about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think they would that intrigues them, in that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Me, I'd rather, okay, this is what I know. You know, just last night, as a matter of fact, my wife and I were sitting in the room, and she asked me something about that had to do with church, and I said, it works like this, and that was what I knew. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's all the knowledge I know. Well, that answer wasn't sufficient for her. I said, well, then you need to ask this. Well, why don't you know? I said, well, this is the only answer I've got. Like, this is, if it's different from that, or there needs to be different from that, I don't have that answer. You'll have to take it up with them. But she wanted an answer that I couldn't provide. And I was comfortable with not having the answer. She wasn't as comfortable with me not having the answer,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think sometimes in our relationship with God, it's that way. I think some people are comfortable with not having the answer. Some people, as a matter of fact, some people might even rather have it that way. They
Mm-hmm.
prefer to dwell where there's not concrete things.
Right.
While other people, like, they've got to have it and they need to know the details. The older I get, you talked about maturing in wisdom. The older I get, the I think it's the more I realize I don't know, than I thought I did.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm coming to the realization that I don't know it. But I also think we can become more sure about what we do.
Right.
That's one of the things I think we see in Job is he doesn't know a lot of things, but he's confident in God's faithfulness. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we finish up our week talking about the book of Job.